The conference room on the 42nd floor of Holt Capital's downtown tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the financial district like a throne overlooking conquered land. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, overcast, the kind of gray sky that swallows the horizon whole. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Decker Holt, 42, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, flanked by two attorneys and his older brother, who had not been invited but came anyway, because that was what the Holt men did. They showed up in numbers when they smelled blood. Across the table, alone except for a single manila folder, sat Nadia Voss, 34 years old, former senior architect at Holt Development, and, as of 11 days prior, formally separated from the man who had once called her the love of his life in front of 200 guests in the Hamptons. She did not look the way they expected her to look. There were no red eyes, no trembling hands, no hesitation when the paralegal slid the document across the table. She picked up the pen, reviewed the last 2 pages, not performing calm, actually calm, and signed her name in clean, deliberate strokes. Decker watched her with the kind of expression men wear when they've already celebrated. His brother exhaled through his nose, just barely suppressing a smile. One of the attorneys glanced at the other. Nadia capped the pen, set it on the table, and stood. "That's everything?" she asked. "That's everything," Decker said. She nodded once, picked up her folder, and walked out. She didn't look back. And the moment the elevator doors closed behind her, the room behind her erupted in the low, satisfied laughter of men who believed the game was over. It wasn't over. It hadn't even started. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to Morel Folktale Story. We cover stories like this one, real, raw, and completely grounded in the kind of life moments that don't make headlines, but absolutely should. If this is your first time, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, whether it's your kitchen table in Georgia, a quiet Tuesday in Oregon, or somewhere across the world entirely. We read every single one. Now let's get back to Nadia, because what she walked out of that building with was worth considerably more than what she appeared to leave behind. To understand what happened in that conference room, you need to understand what the 7 years before it looked like. Nadia grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona. Her father was a civil engineer who worked for the city. Her mother ran a small bookkeeping practice out of their house. They were not poor, but they were careful, the kind of family that kept a budget on a whiteboard in the kitchen and tracked every dollar with quiet discipline. Nadia was the first in her family to attend a university on a full academic scholarship, the first to get a graduate degree in architecture, and the first to move to New York City with nothing but a duffel bag and a signed lease on a studio apartment in Crown Heights that smelled like old paint and ambition. She was 27 when she met Decker Holt at an industry event in Tribeca. He was charismatic, fast-talking, the kind of man who fills every room he enters with the sound of his own certainty. He told her within 10 minutes of meeting her that her presentation portfolio was the sharpest thing he'd seen at the event. She wasn't flattered. She agreed with him. That was what he said he loved about her, that she didn't need his validation to know her own worth. It took her 4 years to realize that what had attracted him to her was also what he spent the marriage quietly trying to dismantle. The belittling was never dramatic enough to be obvious. It operated in the register of small corrections. A comment about her table manners at his family's dinners. A dismissal of her professional opinion at a Holt Development Board meeting she'd been invited to attend as a spouse, not a professional, though she had designed 3 of the company's signature mixed-use buildings. His mother, Rosalind, who had built the early Holt fortune and passed it to her sons, made it abundantly clear, without ever saying it directly, that she viewed Nadia as temporary. A phase. A girl from the Southwest who had charmed her way into a family where she didn't belong. Rosalind called her the architect, never by name, in a tone that made the words sound like a polite insult. Nadia tolerated it. She worked. She designed. She quietly filed things away. The marriage fractured the way marriages do, not in a single explosion, but in a long series of hairline cracks that spread over months until the structure couldn't bear the weight. The final break came when Nadia discovered that Decker had been working with Rosalind for over a year to reclassify the intellectual property rights to two architectural designs Nadia had created, designs that were currently generating licensing revenue for Holt Development, under a corporate holding structure that effectively transferred ownership to the company. Her name was still on the blueprints. The royalties were no longer going to her. The contract reclassification had been executed with her signature, buried inside a 70-page amendment to her employment agreement that she had been told was a routine update. She had signed it at the end of a 16-hour workday, trusting the husband who handed her the pen. When she confronted Decker, he didn't deny it. He told her the reclassification was a business decision. He told her the designs belonged to the company because they had been created during company time. He told her she was being emotional. And when she said she wanted to talk to a lawyer, he looked at her across the kitchen island of their Fifth Avenue apartment and said, calmly, the way a man says something he has rehearsed, "You can talk to whoever you want. You won't find anything that helps you." She filed for divorce 9 days later. What followed was what the Holt family expected, a lopsided settlement negotiation in which a woman of modest origins, with no family wealth and no corporate equity to speak of, agreed to walk away from a 7-year marriage with a cash settlement of $340,000, a 3-year-old Volvo SUV, and her personal belongings. No stake in Holt Development. No claim to the Fifth Avenue apartment. No challenge to the IP reclassification. Decker's legal team had prepared for a war. What they got instead was a white flag. They should have found that strange. They didn't, because they had underestimated her from the beginning, and by the time a person has spent years being underestimated, the habit calcifies in the people around them. They stop looking. They stop checking. They see what they expect to see: a woman with limited resources, limited leverage, and limited options, and they stop looking for anything else. Nadia's one ally in all of this was a woman named Sable Okafor, 41 years old, a transactional attorney in private practice who had spent 12 years working in intellectual property and corporate contract litigation. Nadia had met Sable 6 years earlier at a women's professional network event and had kept in touch with methodical, unhurried consistency, the way Nadia kept in touch with everyone she trusted, which was a small number of people chosen with great care. When Nadia first called Sable 3 weeks before the conference room signing, the conversation lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Sable had said something that made Nadia set down her glass of water very slowly. They didn't look at what you built before the marriage. Here's what Decker's legal team had not reviewed with any seriousness: the 18 months Nadia spent before she ever met Decker Holt. In that window, working entirely independently, she had developed and filed provisional patents on a structural load distribution methodology she called VRX, a proprietary system for calculating thermal expansion tolerances in mixed-use high-rise facades. It was technical, dense, and not easily legible to a generalist attorney. She had never commercialized it during the marriage because Decker had consistently advised her against it, telling her the market wasn't ready, that it was too niche, that she should focus on the work Holt Development was already paying her to do. She had accepted this advice without abandoning the underlying asset. The VRX methodology had been registered as a sole proprietorship under a limited liability company that Nadia had formed in her own name prior to the marriage. She had paid the LLC's annual fees every year, quietly, from a personal account. The LLC had never generated revenue. It had never appeared in any financial disclosure relevant to the marriage because no attorney had ever thought to ask about pre-marital intellectual property held in a dormant LLC. Decker's team had looked for accounts, properties, and marital assets. They had not looked for a 7-year-old patent filing on structural engineering methodology. Sable had looked, and what she found was that VRX, The methodology Nadia had never commercialized was now the subject of significant industry interest. While the divorce proceedings were consuming the attention of everyone in Decker's orbit, the global construction technology space had shifted. Three major international infrastructure firms had independently begun exploring thermal expansion solutions in tall building facade systems. Two of them had filed research inquiries that brushed directly against the protected methodology in Nadia's patent. One of them had already reached out to Holt Development, not to Nadia, because the public record of her design work was tied to the company's portfolio. Holt Development had responded to that inquiry without informing Nadia. Decker's team had assumed the methodology belonged to the company under the IP reclassification they had engineered. They had assumed wrong. The reclassification had covered designs created during Nadia's employment. VRX had been created before her employment, before the marriage, registered to an entity that had nothing to do with Decker Holt. They had overreached, and in their overreach, they had also inadvertently entered into a preliminary negotiation with a Munich-based infrastructure firm on behalf of intellectual property they did not own. That was not a civil inconvenience. That was tortious interference. That was fraud. Sable had the documentation. All of it. If you're still with this story, and I think you are, drop the words "still watching" in the comments. Seriously, I want to see how many of you are tracking every piece of this. Because what happens next is the part that nobody in that conference room saw coming. Not Decker. Not Rosalind. Not the two attorneys who watched Nadia sign those papers with a smile they didn't even bother to hide. The ticking clock arrived in the form of a financing deadline. The Munich firm, Kessler Infrastructure Group, had a board approval window of 60 days from their initial inquiry to finalize any licensing negotiations. Holt Development, operating on the assumption that they controlled the VARX methodology, had been communicating with Kessler's acquisition team for 6 weeks by the time Nadia signed the divorce papers. There were 14 days left on the Kessler window. 14 days before Holt Development would either have to produce clean title documentation for the intellectual property, documentation they could not produce, or watch a $4.2 million licensing deal collapse. Nadia knew this because Sable had filed a records request that surfaced the preliminary communications. She knew it the morning she walked into that conference room. She knew it when she uncapped the pen. She knew it when she signed. She signed because she needed them to believe the game was over. She signed because the moment Holt Development believed she was neutralized, they would move aggressively toward closing the Kessler deal. And the moment they moved to close, they would be required to produce title documentation to a law firm that would discover, within hours, what the Holt legal team had never bothered to look for. On the 9th day after the signing, Sable sent a single certified letter to Holt Development's general counsel, with copies to Kessler Infrastructure Group's Munich legal team and the intellectual property registry. The letter was 11 pages. It included the original LLC registration, the provisional patent filing dated 4 years before Nadia's first day of employment at Holt Development, the complete filing history, a timeline demonstrating the methodology predated the marriage by 18 months, and a detailed legal analysis establishing that the IP reclassification Decker's team had executed, the one buried in the employment contract amendment, was void as applied to any pre-marital asset held by a separate legal entity. The letter closed with a formal demand. All communications with Kessler Infrastructure Group regarding VARX methodology must cease immediately, and Holt Development must issue a written acknowledgement of Nadia's sole ownership within 72 hours or face litigation for fraud and tortious interference in an amount that Sable calculated conservatively at $11 million. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Holt Development's general counsel had called Decker. By Wednesday evening, Decker had called Rosalind. The call between Decker and his mother lasted 47 minutes, which was 43 minutes longer than their calls typically ran. By Thursday morning, Kessler's Munich team had placed Holt Development's communications director on a formal hold, pending clarification of ownership. By Thursday afternoon, the Holt brothers were in a conference room with 3 attorneys trying to understand how a $4.2 million licensing deal had evaporated in less than 24 hours. The public moment came on a Friday, 18 days after the divorce was signed, at an industry event hosted at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of event that attracted the intersection of architecture, real estate development, and corporate finance that Nadia had been moving through professionally for nearly a decade. She had not been invited as a guest. She had been invited as a keynote speaker. Sable had quietly coordinated with the organizers 3 weeks earlier, during a window when everyone's attention was on the divorce settlement. The topic of Nadia's keynote was announced in the program simply as proprietary systems in modern infrastructure design. The room held roughly 300 people. Decker Holt was in attendance because Holt Development was a platinum sponsor of the event. He did not know Nadia was on the program. He saw her name in the printed agenda while he was at the welcome cocktail reception, standing with his brother, and the color change in his face was visible to the 2 colleagues standing nearest to him. She walked out to the podium in a navy dress with no jewelry and no notes. She did not scan the crowd for him. She began by describing VRX. Calmly, technically, the way an architect describes a system she has spent years refining. And within 6 minutes, the room understood they were listening to someone explain a methodology that the industry had been circling for 2 years without knowing its origin. She mentioned, without naming Holt Development, that there had been recent confusion in the commercial licensing space about the ownership of certain pre-marital intellectual property. She said it the way a professor mentions a common misconception, evenly, without malice. Legal counsel was resolving the matter. The methodology remained wholly owned by Voss Design Technologies, LLC, which would be entering into a direct licensing agreement with Kessler Infrastructure Group the following month. She paused. The room was very quiet. She thanked the audience for their time, mentioned that her firm would be open for partnership inquiries beginning January, and walked off the stage to the kind of measured, slightly stunned applause a room gives when it has processed something it didn't expect. Decker did not applaud. He sat at a round table near the back of the ballroom with his brother and 2 colleagues, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had lost a deal. It was the expression of a man who had only just realized, with horrible clarity, that the woman he had spent years dismissing had been 4 moves ahead of him for the last month, and that every confident decision his legal team had been made inside a perimeter she had drawn. Rosalind Holt learned about the keynote that evening from her younger son. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Who reviewed the pre-marital filings?" No one answered. Because no one had reviewed them. Because no one had thought they needed to. Nadia flew to Munich 10 days later on a direct flight booked in her own name, through Voss Design Technologies, to finalize the preliminary terms with Kessler Infrastructure Group. The licensing agreement was, in final form, worth $4.8 million over 4 years, with performance escalators that could push it significantly higher if VRX was integrated into Kessler's European infrastructure pipeline. The deal was structured to include a consulting retainer that kept Nadia actively engaged as the methodology's developer, meaning she would be in the room for every major application of her own work for the foreseeable future. She did not take a private jet. She flew business class, in the middle of the afternoon, with a paperback novel and a coffee. She arrived in Munich the following morning, took a cab to the hotel, and slept for 9 hours. Holt Development, meanwhile, was managing 3 simultaneous crises: the collapsed Kessler deal, the internal review triggered by the IP reclassification error, and a preliminary inquiry from the same counsel Sable had retained about the fraudulent misrepresentation in the employment contract amendment. Decker had been advised by his legal team to prepare for the possibility that the inquiry would become formal litigation. Rosalind had been advised that the IP reclassification if scrutinized by an outside auditor, might expose a pattern of conduct toward other employees that the company did not want examined under any external lens. The $340,000 settlement Nadia had accepted, the one that had made Decker's team laugh, looked different now from where they were standing. It looked like the most expensive misreading of a situation the company had ever made. It looked like what happens when powerful people stop examining the ground beneath them because they're too busy enjoying the view. The last thing worth knowing about Nadia Voss is something Sable mentioned in an interview much later, when asked how a woman with no legal background had navigated a corporate divorce against a family with 9 figures in assets and a team of specialized attorneys. Sable paused before answering. Then she said, "She didn't beat them with resources. She beat them with patience. They spent the whole marriage telling her she was smaller than she was. She let them believe it right up until it cost them everything. That is, sometimes, how it works. Not with a dramatic confrontation. Not with a speech. Not with a moment designed for anyone else's consumption. Just a woman who knew exactly what she had, waited for exactly the right moment, and walked into a conference room on a Tuesday morning prepared to sign papers that everyone else in that room thought were her surrender, because she understood something none of them did. The papers were not her surrender. The papers were the opening move. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Someone who pays attention, follows every turn, and understands that the most powerful moments don't always announce themselves. Leave a comment with the one word that describes how this story made you feel. Anger? Satisfaction? Something harder to name? I read every comment. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so the next story finds you before the week is out. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this one today, share it with them. No explanation needed. Just send it. They'll understand why.